Well, I've learned lots of things. I suppose the first thing that I've learned is that people, when they're passionate about something, they love to share their knowledge. And they're not worried about whether they're going to get any financial gain out of it, whether they're going to get any exposure. Of course, all that's a bonus. But when you're passionate about what you do, you could talk about something for hours and it's just like having, just having fun. So I think that's one thing I've learned about people. The other thing I've learned about interviewing over 200 guests now is that every single person has gold to give. And like a lot of podcastees will chase the high level, high ticket guests, big famous people, celebrities. But my view is I kind of love to just talk to the everyday person that's running an everyday business, because everybody has a journey that you can learn from. Everybody has got gold that we can extract. And that's kind of my job as a podcast host, in trying to get the gold and extract all the information out of my guest, but also try and get those little tidbits of information that I can learn from and adapt and use in whatever else I do. So I just think there's so much gold that people have, and it's just about how we extract that from people, and people are just never cease to surprise me.
That passion piece, how often do they actually just get to talk freely about what they're passionate about? Because a lot of friends don't really care about your business.
100%.
They care about the footy and all things that you're not interested in. So when they get this opportunity just to speak openly, what does it really mean for them?
Oh, it's like you've opened up the door and they're having fun. They're like a kid in a candy store again. They've just spent the last 10, 20, 30 years leveraging and experimenting and trying all sorts of different things to put together this knowledge base, and nobody's ever going to be listening to them apart from, one or two colleagues at work. So when you can jump on a podcast and say, all right, now you've got 20 minutes, 30 minutes, half an hour, 50 minutes, whatever it is, let's talk. They could go on for hours. And sometimes you have to actually try and shut them down because they're having so much fun. And they forget they're even on a podcast.
They must feel so free to be able to get on there and for somebody just to listen. And definitely. I think a lot of us talk, a lot of us speak, but we're not trained listeners. Absolutely. And there's nothing greater than having somebody just to listen. It's like why people go to they say the older that people get, when they want an audience, they call a doctor. Because the doctor goes in, Mr. Saul, great to see you today. And they go through the whole process and the doctor listens.
Yep. So true.
Must be so freeing for them. And what do you see happen to them after the podcast? Once they share that knowledge and that passion comes back to the surface, what happens after the podcast?
Well, I mean, they're just they're very happy. They're engaged. They're radiant. They're thoroughly excited. And it's just like they've had the best time of their life. They walk off the call really excited. They might refer other people as well to the podcast, which is also part of the strategy. And, they're just happy to have had someone listen to them and happy to have someone soak up their knowledge. And there's a really good point that you made, that and a lot of podcast hosts tend to jump in a bit too often and talk too much. Whereas, as you said, the art of navigating through a conversation and facilitating a conversation is in the listening and just knowing what to ask when, and then stepping back and letting your guests take the stage. And a lot of people still haven't mastered that, including myself, but that's something that it's a lifelong journey, and interviewing is a skill, just like anything else.
It is an absolute skill, and it also requires preparation. For my podcast, I like to figure out what are 3 good questions that I can ask, and then we can expand from there. And for me, I believe that also gives my guests a bit of comfort. Okay, this is going to be the show outline, so they can have a level of preparation. And I've been in situations before where I've been on podcasts and I've shown up and the host hasn't done any background research.
Yeah.
They don't ask good questions. And then the ones that they do ask, you're like, oh, gee, that could have been framed a lot better.
Exactly. And then it just becomes a schoolyard chat that can go off on a million tangents, and people get lost because there's no structure or framework to the conversation. They're not learning anything. They're not getting any true value out of it. It's all fun a little bit every now and again for a bit of entertainment, but I jump on a podcast to learn something. So I like it. I like to know what I'm going to be learning.
Touch on that value piece. What does an audience consider value in a podcast? And we've got to be able to figure this out because everybody's screaming out for your attention. We say that attention is the most precious commodity on the planet. You drive down the street and you're going to see thousands of advertisements a day. You're going to go to YouTube. There's millions of channels. And we've got to capture attention. So what do they consider value?
Well, it's very personal. I mean, everybody's got their own idea of what's valuable to them, of what information or entertainment or whatever it is they're jumping on a podcast for, or any other form of content. Might be an audiobook, might be a video, might be anything. Everybody's got their own idea of what they want to get out of it. So it kind of boils down to, if you're putting a podcast strategy together, whether that's in audio or video form, is to really identify your target market very well, understand who they are, and then give them what they need. And one great way to give people what they need is to ask them. Ask your audience what they need, and then learn from the feedback, learn what episodes do better than others, reflect on why, and then start giving people more and more value of what they need to take away. And so it's really, we can't assume that someone will like something more than something else. We have to learn to ask, but we also have to learn to identify through feedback what's working and what's not.
It seems so simple.
Yeah.
Ask the audience what they want.
Yeah.
And then give them what they need.
Exactly. Simple as that. And you build an audience that's huge.
And then gather feedback. Yeah. How are we doing? Are we going in the right direction?
Yeah, very simple.
Why wouldn't a host do that?
Good point. A good question. Well, I think a lot of people generally in marketing and in business, we want to assume that this is the right pathway, this is the right strategy. We have a gut feeling of what we think is going to work, but a lot of the time the market can tell you something exactly the opposite. And the perfect example of that is content on social media. Sometimes you put out a piece of content that you think is going to kill, and then nobody likes it. And then you put out something that you think is absolute rubbish, and people go crazy and it goes viral. So it's just a great example of, you never know what people really want, and you can't assume because you think it's interesting that someone else will think it's interesting as well. So I think that's the biggest issue, but we don't take enough time to really learn about the other side, and we tend to be a little bit more arrogant in a way and think that we know what we're doing. And we also get into that frequency or that rhythm of tunnel vision because we're busy. We've got lots of stuff going on. We don't have time to start entertaining other things because it will throw us off track. We just want to get on with our path like this, but we could be going the wrong direction.
Well, I have a confession to make. I had a guest on my podcast and I showed up on time. I know you were 10 minutes early today. I saw you in the waiting room. So we're not talking about you.
As are you. I know you are as well.
and I was there and I was waiting, and 11 o'clock came, and then 11:01 and they weren't here, and 11:02, 11:03, 11:04, 11:05, they're still not here. Yep. And I was starting to get this uncomfortable feeling, and I'm thinking, you know what? I'm actually quite excited that this person hasn't shown up because I'm feeling a really strange feeling. Yeah. And anyway, the guest showed up, and it was an uncomfortable podcast for me. I just felt like this energy, the frequency wasn't the same. It was a mismatch of energy. And I was kind of even praying, like, I hope the internet drops out or something like that. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyway, it didn't. And the episode went for longer than I expected and anticipated. Yeah. And I even said to my team, I said, look, I think this is going to be a real shocker. Like, I really just didn't have the vibe on this one, and I don't know if it's what our audience wants. And anyway, I edited it. I put it out. We put the reels out, and it was one of my best performing podcasts.
There you go. Perfect
and it was
example.
The reels that got like more than 1,500 views just in a couple of days. And I was like, oh my gosh, I even had it wrong. And I'm the host, and I've done the research.
It happens to me all the time.
Okay, I'm not alone. What's your experience?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I put out an episode and I think, this is not that interesting. This this is, it's very niche. Nobody's got to be interested in this. And it does really well. Or I put out a little reel or a YouTube short and I think, what's in it? And that's the piece that does really well compared to other stuff that I thought was true gold. So you just can't, that's the beauty of human nature in a way. We can't assume anything about anybody else. We just have to put it out there and see what happens. And I suppose bringing that right back to building a marketing strategy or a podcast strategy is that a lot of people tend to overanalyze up front before they even get started, and they'll talk themselves out of doing everything because they've done way too much thinking. Whereas if you would have just started, put it out there, learned as you go, steer the ship while it's in the air, or the plane while it's in the air, you can have a lot of fun, and it's amazing the results that you'll get because you just don't know. It's very unpredictable.
Mm. We can learn from success, and we can also learn from failure. What would you say are the top 3 mistakes that a guest makes on a podcast?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say number 1 is and not that everybody does this, but if I was going to pick out just an example of, a couple of interviews that I might have done, not everybody prepares well enough for their show. So I think that's a real point, and you alluded to that earlier, is that if you're going to go on a show, you have to be prepared. You have to at least have a little bit of a think beforehand and map out in your head how you're going to tackle certain questions and what kind of value you're going to bring. The other thing is, I think, and this is what I'm not great at either, something that I'm trying to learn more, is we need to tell more stories. Storytelling, because everybody's giving you facts and figures and tidbits of information, but we need to tell more stories that grab us emotionally. And I think, and that's an art form in itself. So it's something that I'm trying to learn myself. Not that I do a lot of talking when I'm on my show. I tend to ask more questions. But I think if people told more stories, that's really great. And I actually ask my guests sometimes to tell us a story. Give us an example of when this happened. Tell us what happened. Tell us why. What was the outcome? Tell us a story about this. So I try to solicit stories from my guests if I can. And another thing that I think people don't do, and this kind of boils down to the name of your podcast, which is leverage, which I love. I love that word leverage. I just use that all the time. And I think that from a point of view of what people do after the episode is they don't leverage what they've just done. So someone has just taken 30, 40 minutes to interview you. You've got an incredible piece of master content. Nobody does anything with it. Nobody chops it up. Nobody transcribes it. Nobody repackages it. And it's just lost forever. And they think it's just going to get one shot at an audience and they'll forget about it and move on to the next podcast. Crazy. It's all about leveraging your content. You should be leveraging this stuff for the next 6 months.
I learned how to leverage webinars, and it came through disappointments. It came through mistakes. It was 2012, and Nini had just lost her job with Emirates after she had her accident on the aircraft, and we started our business in 2013. And I was doing webinars. Webinars it's just like a podcast, but there's a live audience. Yep. And so I prepared. I had 5,000 leads, 1,500 people register, and on the night, nobody showed up.
Wow.
But I was prepared, and I thought to myself for a moment, maybe I should just pull the plug. Wow. And I won't do it. But I thought, no, you know what? I've spent the money. Nobody's here. I'll just record it. And I recorded it, and I thought, this is great content. And then I thought, what can I do with it now? So I turned it into a book. And then I took the book and I published the book. Brilliant. And nobody bought the book. So I thought to myself, I said, there's got to be a better way. Yep. So what I started to do, Darren, was I started to send the books out to business owners. Yep. And I'd say, hey, here's a book, read this. And they'd call me and go, oh my gosh, this is incredible. And so from that one webinar where nobody showed up to putting into a book that nobody bought to giving it away for free, I made hundreds of thousands of dollars in coaching and consulting sales.
Yep.
And even still today, so that was 2013, I've used the same method. And I do a podcast and I turn it into a book. And people say, gee, you write books really fast.
Wow.
Like, you don't have to write it. You speak a book.
That's right.
You go on a podcast and you speak your book.
That's
and
right.
if you prepare and you do 2 or 3 podcasts, that could give you 9 chapters in a book.
Very true.
All you've got to do is write an introduction and a summary at the end, and there's your 11 chapters.
Very true. I think that's so true. I think leveraging what you've already done is such a great strategy. And a lot of people think, I'm doing all this stuff for free. I'm going to stop doing this for free because it's not bringing me any revenue. But if you think about it from a leverage point of view, how can we do stuff for free, but then leverage it and turn it into a strategy like what you've just described to make you hundreds of thousands of dollars? It's all about how we think about things.
Well, if you think about it, you've got 25 minutes of content where you're featured as the authority and the expert in the space.
Definitely.
You've got Instagram where they do the reels. And if you break down your 25-minute conversation, you can probably get at least 20 good reels or 20 good shorts. You can put them on YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can put them on TikTok. You can send them via WhatsApp to people. And then you can transcribe that and you can have a blog every day of the week for the next 30 days. And that's just the beginning. And then if you go from podcast to podcast, you can compile your book. Yeah. And a lot of people think, I can't write a book. A book's got to be 300 pages. No, nobody wants to listen to or read a 300-page book anymore.
That's right.
You write what's called a monograph. And the monograph is a short book and it's less than 100 pages.
Great.
And there's no bullshit. It's just the meat, no bone, throw away the bone. There's the meat. There's no fat. The fat's been trimmed off.
Yep.
And you solve one problem in a book. Not all the business people's problems, just one problem. And you have 3 short chapters and a call to action.
Love it. So
that's it. And that's it. And think about it.
For graphics, you could make it really engaging, keep it simple. And I just thought of another thing while you were talking. You could even take so many podcasts for the year and turn it into a greatest hits album and somehow have a shortened version of that as well, because people like those little tidbits sometimes more than the full episode because they don't have time to listen to the whole episode. How could we turn it into a bit of a greatest hits album of tidbits that might give people value? I mean, there's no end to what you could do.
I released one book probably 2 years ago. I've even forgotten the title now. and what I was on a podcast and it went for about an hour and a half. And the host had prepared and asked some wonderful questions. So when I took the transcript, I then sent it to a ghostwriter and I said, look, this is a conversation, but turn it into a book.
Yeah.
And then when I created the book, I put the host's name as co-author. And then I sent the host a book and I said, hey, we just wrote a book together. Please distribute this to your audience. And the host was like, this is incredible. Nobody's ever done this before. I said, well, let's just do it together. And so I turned that into a downloadable PDF. It was a marketing process. People came to the website, downloaded it, and then they showed up to the live event.
Amazing.
And now we wrote a book together. So we might write a book today.
Yep. I'd love to. And again, you've leveraged with the host, with the writer, with the guest writer, the ghost
Absolutely.
writer.
Absolutely.
So it's all about how can you put stuff together and leverage whatever you're doing.
You got to leverage. A lot of people think podcasts are a fad. They're nice to do. I'll get around to it someday. But I think your opinion is that podcasting is going to be a must-have in the future.
Indeed.
What's your thinking behind that?
Podcasts have been around for a long time. They've kind of made a resurgence now with digital technology. And even during the pandemic, the technology got so good. And even before the call, we were just discussing what Riverside can do, which is a great podcast editing and housing software. So it's amazing the technology that's available. Everybody can put together a home studio in $300-400 without thinking. But the true gold of a podcast strategy is in the marketing content. So for me, podcasts give me 2 things. They give me brand awareness and trust and credibility to my target audience, but they also give me content, as we've been discussing, marketing content in all forms: video, audio, graphic, screenshots, audiograms, photographs, whatever, written blogs and transcripts, etc. So I think the war, it's already happening. At the moment, we're all in a war for attention, as you mentioned. And to take that even further, we're in a war for content. It's a battle for content. Whose content is going to be more interesting, more valuable, more engaging, and more frequent, and even bigger in terms of volume than somebody else's? How are we going to get the eyeballs on us? And the answer to me is using a podcast strategy. because it's so much more powerful than one person just talking about their products and services every single day, till the cows come home. It gets very, very boring and very, very stale. Whereas particularly if you have a podcast guest, what a great conversation. We're collaborating. It's not a hard sell, but you're putting together content in spades that you're going to be able to leverage in all these ways we've just discussed today. And that's where the battlefield is going to be played in terms of it's a war for content. And it's just going to get more and more competitive and noisy moving forward. So I think that's where people can really, really do well if they put together and dedicate some time into putting a really good podcast strategy together.
Mm. Statistically, most people quit their podcasts after 5 to 7 episodes.
Yeah.
And I think they've been sold this idea that the podcast is going to be a revenue stream.
Definitely.
Now, if your profession is podcasting, that's a different story. But the podcast is not, in my opinion, a revenue stream. It's not direct. It's indirect.
Definitely.
So as a consultant, people pay me for advice, but I can't give advice without a payment. So a lot of people start to wonder, well, what's it like to work with Daniel? What would it be like to have a conversation with Daniel? Yep. And what the podcast does is they give an insight into what it's like to have a conversation with me without them having to pay for it.
Amazing.
So as they do their due diligence, they could say, well, yes, I could have a conversation with Daniel for the next 6 or 12 months. That'd be wonderful. Others will say he's not for me. And that's perfectly okay, because when people want to make a buying decision, they don't want pressure.
Agree.
They don't want to be sold to. People aren't stupid anymore. People are intelligent. They've read all the books as well. They've got businesses.
That's right.
They want to make the decision. So they look at this and say, well, that's the person that I could work with.
Yeah.
And I also find it's very good, not just for the initial sales conversations, it's very good for referrals and retention, because sometimes your clients don't get to see you operate outside of their business.
Yes.
And you're having a conversation with another expert and they're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize Daniel does that. Yep. And then they can leverage your knowledge once again. Hey, Daniel, I saw you on the podcast. We've got this problem in the business. Could you come and solve that as well? And all of a sudden, you've got an extension.
Exactly. Yep.
The other thing that I do, Darren, and you were talking about it before, is I listen to my clients. So when I create my podcast, I'm not looking for 1 million views. I'm not looking for 1,000 views. I'm looking for 100 views because I know my clients are going to watch it. And I listen in my coaching sessions, and if they have a problem that I don't solve, I go and find a guest who's an expert in that area. I interview them. I go back to the client and say, hey, I just interviewed somebody who talks about your problem, and I've also vetted them. Perfect. They're a great person, and I recommend that you get on a call. And then I build my network.
Love it.
So it becomes social engineering.
Yep.
And for me, I've got contacts all around the world, and if my clients have a problem, I just introduce them to one of my guests. I say, first, watch the video. If you like the look of them, if you like the sound of them, if you get the right vibe, I will send them across.
Amazing. Yep.
And that's where the business grows. And for me, living overseas, it's the perfect strategy. I can talk to anybody. I don't have to leave the house. And I get a wonderful conversation. I did an episode called Daniel and the Doctors.
Right.
And so I said to my team, I said, I just want doctors on my podcast because I want to learn from these people directly. I don't want to go to university. And I think I interviewed around about 35 or 40 doctors.
Wow.
And so these are some of the most intelligent people, but I've got them on the podcast just with me, all to myself.
Amazing. Yep.
And that's how I leverage it. And I think if we think beyond just a revenue stream and you look at the bigger picture and you can zoom out, you can see how much growth you can actually have.
Indeed. I mean, it's just an amazing strategy from so many dimensions. And the more you do it, the more you realize that you haven't even touched the surface. There's so much you can do with it. But as you said right back at the beginning, is that it's not a direct revenue stream. Think of it as how to leverage indirect audience, indirect leads, indirect network building, and it can really generate amazing opportunities. One
thing I've also found is you can make sales on a podcast as a host, which is fascinating. It's never my target, but at the end of the conversation, I've had many guests lean over and say, hey, Daniel, you know that topic you're talking about? That's my problem.
Love it.
Could you help me?
Yep.
And just last week, I had a guest on and they leant over and they said, hey, could I try some of your technology? And I said, absolutely. They said, what's the cost? I said, don't worry about the cost. You've been here. Let me show you. Let me do you a favor. You've been on my podcast. Let me take care of this for you.
Love that.
And then you start these collaborations. And for me, also, I've had people hire me as a coach, as a consultant. They've purchased my programs, but it was never direct. That wasn't the intention. I think when the intention is to get people on your podcast and pitch to, I think that's when you get into some dirty and murky water. I had it happen to me. It was a whole setup, and I realized at the end of it that I was set up for a sales conversation. I went, oh no. I said to the guy, I said, you're not pitching to me, are you?
Oh, no. It was like a new generation of Amway.
It was join my, yes. And I was like, no, thank you.
Oh no.
But like you said there, it's indirect.
It's very indirect, and it's very indirect. It's passive. And I think that's where its power is as well for the audience, is that if an audience is scrolling through their feed or watching a video or whatever, and they see two people talking about a topic that they might be interested in, and they're not talking at them. Like a lot of the times on social media now, if you scroll down your feed, everybody's talking directly at the camera. They're talking at you. They're trying to sell something. They're trying to push a product, push a perspective, push an agenda. Whereas this is much more passive. You can take a breath. You're listening into a conversation. It's almost like you're inviting them in rather than pushing them away. And that's really powerful from a psychological point of view, I think. So you're basically inviting your audience and your potential audience in for a chat. And that's how you build trust and build credibility over time, rather than always just promoting and pushing your product and service and people just run away.